Hello, everybody. Peter Robbins, and I have esteemed guest Santiago Rivas. I hope I pronounced that properly, Santiago.
Yeah. Yes.
Um, so just tell me a little bit. How did you get involved in just in aviation history, or even just history in general? I mean, what was your education background, and how did you get invested in this topic, and how did you get to the point where you felt like you either knew enough about it or wanted to know more about it enough to make a book about it? So I'll give you the floor for a little bit. Just kind of tell me how you got into this. How did you create this lovely book? Hopefully, no, can't see it there, but Skyhawks over the South Atlantic is what we're talking about. So go ahead, Santiago.
Yeah, it's funny because I started because of my grandfather, but in fact he was a Navy officer. He was a submariner, so nothing
Very good.
related with aviation. But since was a very young, I started like in the military history, military what was happening in the military in Argentina, but also in Latin America.
Right.
But then I start going through aviation when since was I was very young,
Right.
and and also because we had the Malvinas or Falklands War with the UK. This was very important for us to reach, and I was very young when the war happened,
Right.
so it was in my memory. And since I started researching, or I was working as a journalist in aviation, I met a lot of veterans. So I started around 25 years ago in 1997. So by
Wow.
then, many veteran pilots were still in service with the Argentine Air Force, Argentine Navy. So since then, I started researching about the war.
Hmm.
In regards to with the Skyhawks in 1998, I did my first article for a local magazine about there are all the Argentine Skyhawks with three other authors. We covered the history of all the articles for it was a special issue.
Hmm.
So since then, I started researching a lot about the history of the Skyhawks, but also about the war. And in fact, regarding the war, I started researching about the whole war, mainly air war.
Okay.
So in 19 no, so in 2007 I did my first book, which was for a Brazilian editor. It was a small book, but it was the first book released in Portuguese about the air war. So and since then
Oh,
I
wow.
started
Okay.
researching more and more about the air war.
You bring up an interesting topic there. Just how much interest is there in this conflict from in the other countries in Latin America? Like, yeah, I mean, you mentioned Brazil. Is it kind of like an equal interest just from just a Latin American defense sense, or just in general? Is it as interesting a topic generally in other countries nearby?
Yeah, especially with people related with aviation, it's very interesting, especially military aviators, because it was the only conventional conflict with a lot of aviation in Latin America. We had some other small conflicts, like the one between Ecuador and Peru in 1995, but it was very small, limited to only a few air operations
Right.
and nothing out from from normal. There was just a few air combats.
Right.
So the Malvinas War was very special for all the Latin American aviation because it
Right.
involves one Latin American country fighting against a NATO country.
Okay, So
Something that, yeah,
so here's an interesting question, and feel free to say pass, or but do you feel like the conflict may have even brought Latin America together in some odd way, or you know what I mean, from just a kind of like an aviation pride, or anything to that degree, or.
and I don't think the whole Latin America, but
Okay.
yes, in some ways,
Do
some
you
countries felt close to Argentina,
Right,
and
right. And do you feel like it might even have kind of healed some wounds, if you will? Or did it, you know what I mean? Did it kind of maybe even lighten lighten any animosity, even with other countries
Yeah.
at all? Yeah.
I think that, for example, Argentina, with the only country that always had some conflicts was with Chile.
Right. Sure.
But by
Absolutely.
then, things were very hard because we were almost at war with Chile in
Right.
1978.
Right.
So Chile was supporting the British side.
Right.
So this brings some animosities still until today between
Okay.
some people in both
Okay.
countries.
Right.
So, but for example, other countries like Peru or Brazil or Venezuela, they supported completely the
Okay.
Argentine position.
Okay. I'll see. So how did you go about approach? When did you know you wanted to write a book specifically about Skyhawks in the South Atlantic conflict? Like what was the? Did you just have enough? Did you have enough material from your previous articles and so on that you felt like you could expand upon it and end up with enough for a book? Or is this, well, without getting too deep into it if you don't want to, but I mean, if was this the first publisher you went to? Did you first do it in Spanish and try to release it locally at all, or how did the book come to be, I guess, is the ultimate question.
Yeah, I think the origin of this book started when in 2012 I made a bigger book which is called Wings of the Malvinas, which was released also in the UK,
Hmm.
which covered the entire air war from the Argentine perspective. So after that book, I keep finding more and more information about all the different aircraft and squadrons. And the Skyhawks was one of the, I think, maybe the most interesting aircraft of the war because they have most of the missions against British ships or also against ground targets were made by the Skyhawks, both from the Navy and the Air Force. It's also the type that was lost in bigger quantities because, of course, they were the most important during the war. They made more missions. And over the years after that book, I started talking with more and more veteran pilots. So I found that I had a lot of material to do a specific book only on the Skyhawks. So that's why we started with the book in English. Now we released this year in Argentina in Spanish.
Okay. Pretty good.
So, and the idea was maybe in the future to cover other aircraft like the Mirages or Pucarás or others.
Right.
But
Or the dagger as well,
yeah,
right? So yeah, the dagger had pretty limited utilization, right? I do remember you mentioning it towards the end of the book. So relatively speaking, well, first of all, there was a smaller amount of daggers, but the dagger was transitioned to mostly a strike capability. Is that not my? Hopefully, I'm remembering that correctly. Um,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, they
Okay.
were used in both missions, like air to
Right.
air, only on the
Right.
first day of the war,
Right.
and then only after that, only as a strike aircraft. But also
Right.
on the first day, some aircraft were used for air to air, and others to anti-ship missions.
And I seem to remember you mentioning it in the book. Of course, I'm forgetting the exact page and quote. But what was the transition? What was did they realize it was better utilized as a strike aircraft? Did they overestimate the capabilities of the dagger? Or I mean, the dagger is in effect, is it not is it an Israeli
Yeah,
version of the Mirage
yeah,
3
Mirage
or 5?
5.
5, yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
in fact, it's funny because the official version is that it's an Israeli-built aircraft, but in
Right.
fact, the planes were built in France and sent the parts secretly to Israel because there was
Mm,
an arms embargo,
mhm.
and in Israel they were only assembled, uh, and they were assembled with support from American personnel, because by then
Yeah,
Israel didn't have the capacity to build a supersonic aircraft. They learned how to do it with the daggers. They were called neshers in
yeah,
Israel,
yeah,
and that was the origin of the kefir that they built after that.
right.
So
And there was some, was it considered at the time that the Israeli missile, was it, I can't remember the name of it,
the
was it
Shafrir,
Shafir? That was considered at least better having better capability than the AIM 9M. Am I correct on that?
No,
Or
yeah, they were using the L, the
yeah,
British, but
right.
one of the main problems with the Dagger was because the Shafir was a very old missile, was equivalent like an AMB 9
That's what
B.
I meant. Yeah, 9B is what I was thinking of
Yeah.
before. Yeah, sorry.
So they
Um,
were in the 1st of May, which was the first day of air
right,
combats over the war. The daggers tried to engage a couple of times the Sea Harriers, and the
right,
problem was always the missile. They never get a lock with the missile.
right. So is it and that was a rear aspect only heat-seeking missile,
Yes.
and that would have been one of the limitations as well. That's probably why the 9L did as reasonably well as it did, right? Because it had that
And
was an all
also
aspect.
the Shafir had the problem. The main problem was that the Shafir many times the missile locked on the sun. So
Mm,
because the first combats they were mostly on the afternoon,
right,
and they
right.
had that problem. Because
Okay,
the British with the L version of the Sidewinder,
right,
despite it was all aspect, talking with some pilots like David Morgan, for example, who
right.
flew during the war, he told me that as they didn't have any training with that version, they use it like the older versions they had. So analyzing all the combats during the war, the British they never tried to fire the Sidewinders from the front, for example.
Right, right. So they never really tested out its full aspect capabilities. You're saying,
Yeah.
yeah, you wouldn't. Yeah, you would probably want to increase your probability, right? Well, we won't get too into that, but we'll start doing like this, and okay. Um,
Yes.
so let's see. So what finally? There are a lot of quotes in the book, and I think I were those primarily primary source interviews. All the most of the pilot dialogue that you have throughout your chapters. Um, I couldn't tell necessarily which ones. I mean, were they from other primary sources, or was it all primarily interviews or interviews that other people had done?
No, in most cases, I did the interviews. There
Okay,
was only a couple of them that were made by a friend,
okay,
but
okay,
I did it over the years. In most of the interviews were made specifically for this book, but some
right,
others I did it over the years in the past.
right.
So since I started researching on the Skyhawks more than 20 years ago, every time I had opportunity to find a pilot, I tried to make him an interview. So
So yeah, um, well, hopefully, yeah. I mean, hopefully, I assume that there was some networking involved with that, right? So yeah, I'm assuming that you would talk to some people, and then they would tell you about other people that were, open to talk about it, and you kind
yeah.
of kept going with it. Um, so some of my questions, hopefully, these aren't off the wall questions, but uh, obviously, there was a lot of issue with distance and refueling. And from what I could tell, and I think this is consistent in other books as well, there were um, not only refueling problems, right? Possibly, I mean, you can tell me maybe it was partly training, training as well as what were some from your vantage point from all the research you did. What were some of the issues that were keeping some of the flights being canceled from a technical perspective?
Yeah, I think the main issue is what the Air Force wasn't prepared for this war. It was something that it was planned mainly by the Navy and the Army. And if you talk with most of the people, of the pilots, for example, they knew about the war on the day Argentina landed on the islands. So there
Right.
was not a big preparation of all the aircraft or all the systems. So when they start deploying it, they start finding some technical problems in some planes, which was many were not flying and they were put into flight very fast. Also, the Patagonia is a very difficult environment to operate.
Right.
There were no hangars, only a few of them. So most of the planes were left on the open for the
Mm,
entire time of the war.
mm,
And humidity, wind, and salt from the sea, because all the bases were close to the sea,
all right.
started making problems with especially with the electronics, all the
Okay.
electrical systems of the plane.
I never
So
even
that's
thought about. I
why,
never even thought about that. But that's a really good point. Yeah. Very
yeah.
good.
And with the tankers, for example, we only had two, so they were flying all the day, refueling the Skyhawks superintendents, and so
So here's a question to you. Just a what if if there was only one tanker operational, do you feel like that would have considerably burdened any of the air planning, right? I mean, it would have probably been quite difficult to maintain, to at least maintain enough sorties during some of the critical points in the conflict,
yeah.
right? Okay. So my other question, I do have a lot of questions around the tankers, and if you don't know the answers, perfectly fine. Um, but how I got the impression, and this is from your book as well as other books kind of combined, that the tankers, the KC-130s, were primarily staying, at least at the beginning of the conflict, they were staying outside of the exclusion zone, maybe approximately 100 nautical miles from like Rio Grande or Rio Gallegos. Hopefully, I pronounced that properly. But is that an appropriate assumption that the tankers were in effect maybe 100 nautical miles from the BAMs or the vans, and then the aircraft were refueling pretty relatively quickly after takeoff? Were they avoiding, just from your research, were they kind of avoiding the exclusion zone differently at different phases of the conflict? Were they? I know from the one example you gave. Let's see, it's on page. I wish I had this exactly. Hold on, it's page 7 in Roman numerals. The in the middle of your book, that was obviously a very unique situations where the KC 130s went way off of their normal patrols, right? Again, from your research, how often were those KC 130 patrol patterns changed, and how was that effectively communicated? Um, it just, to me, it seems like a
Yeah.
logistical nightmare to to keep to keep two tankers up. Where they, and again, you might not have information around this. Were they keeping one up at any one time, or were they kind of just overlapping? What?
Yeah, depended on the missions planned. When they every day they prepare the missions for the next day. So, and that include not only the attack aircraft but also the positioning of the tankers, and to deploy one or two depends on how many flights were expected for that day, and also the positioning of the tankers depended on the targets. If they were, for example, to the east of the islands, or if you were in San Carlos, there was different ranges, so the positioning was different, and usually was one to the south, one to the north,
Right, right,
so to support the operations from Rio Grande, from Rio Gallegos, and from San Julian.
right,
And but all that changes every day according to the needs and to the operational demands that
right.
they had.
I just
As I
brought.
said, in a
Go ahead.
couple of operations, they had to go closer to the islands to mainly to recover planes that were returning with problems. One case, for example, was in the 8th of June when the Skyhawk was returning with the Kent. They had the pilot had a problem with the fuse system, so she cannot use one of the tanks. So because the pump was not working, and there was another case in the 13th of June, the last day of the war,
Hmm.
when the Skyhawk was losing a lot of fuel. So the tanker went approached very, very close to the islands. Even the British detected the tanker with their radars and tried to send the Sea Harriers to intercept it because they knew the plane was almost over the islands.
Interesting.
So yeah, and
Did you find evidence that they had detected it? Is that from uh, um, Was that word of mouth, or is that in a book? I had never I had never read that before. So you're saying that the British actually detected the tanker? Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Um.
So because the tanker was very high, flying high,
Yeah.
and
Sure. Yeah.
I don't remember exactly which ship detected the tanker,
Hmm.
but they tried to send the Sea Harriers, but the Sea Harrier was not available on that area by then. And immediately after, the tanker started returning to the mainland, so
Right.
it was becoming more difficult for the Sea Harriers to try to make an
I
intercept
mean, do you?
because then they have to return to the islands.
Yeah. So that obviously probably was during that kind of like the May 30th time period where they were trying to do the extended mission ranges.
Yeah.
So it's kind of I'm showing you a map real quick just to kind of give folks an idea how much distance we're talking about. So what I've marked here is I have also the maritime exclusion zone kind of marked, and the rough positioning of task force roughly in May 1st ish, right? So I just wanted to show that, I mean, so from the exact center of the Malvinas, that it's 315 nautical miles on as a crow flies, if you will. So what was the Skyhawk on its own larger or largest tank load, its fuel tank load? What was its endurance on its own? Do you know offhand?
Not exactly, no,
Okay.
because one of the problems during this war is that all the approach was done at very low height to avoid radar detection.
Mm, yes.
So that reduced a lot the range of the planes.
Very good.
That's why they always needed a tanker, at least when they were going to the islands, because flying high at
Yeah.
maybe 30,000 feet,
Right.
they can reach the islands and return without problem, without
Yeah.
refueling.
Okay. Okay. Um, right, that's a very good point. That's a very good point. And so about approximately where would they get to before? I know um they would probably fly pretty high until they got to the exclusion zone. Do you think? Or
Yeah, around more than about 200 miles from the islands, they
right.
started descending.
All right, so that would be about so okay, so
Yeah,
pretty much the exclusion zone, roughly.
yeah.
Okay, interesting.
So and but they started descending very not very hard. So
Right,
but they approached when at the time they reached the islands, they were flying already very low. So in most cases during the war, they approached it over the sea from the north or from over the south of the islands.
right,
But during the landings, they also some have a couple of approaches over West Falkland or Grand Malvina Island.
right.
So, but
And
in all
correct,
cases, when they get to the islands, they were flying already very low, usually about 30 feet or less.
right. So correct me if I'm wrong, but primarily the FAA, the Air Force's Skyhawks were out of San Julian and Rio Gallegos, right?
Yeah,
And then what were the A4 the Qs, were they running out of the
yeah,
ban
from
out
Rio
of Rio
Grande.
Grande? Okay, okay, very good. And was there a significant let's see, how do I put this? So was there a significant endurance difference with the Armada versions of the Skyhawks, as far as like I can't remember in reading your book, but was there any significant performance differences just trying to operate those off of a land base in any way? Probably not, right?
Not a big one, but in
Yeah.
some operations, the Navy aircraft were able to fly to the islands without refueling because they
Okay.
were closer than Rio Gallegos and San Julian.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Um. Just gonna get oh yes. The buddy fueling system for the Skyhawk. I mean, how often was that utilized, and was that? It seemed like the Argentine planning would send up at least three or four sortie tactical, strike attack, but it seemed like they also occasionally would um, launch six aircraft, right? One as a reserve, and then one as a a tank buddy, if I read it properly, at least in a few missions. Did they
Yeah.
were they playing around with that, as far as, that's the wrong word, but were they kind of experimenting with how well the tank buddy system would work as opposed to the tanker, or how did
Yeah,
that
in
kind of
fact,
evolve?
the body system was used only on the aircraft carrier because by then only the Navy have it. And the
Oh,
idea was mainly in case of carrier operations, the main worry was because the weather changes very fast on the South Atlantic.
yeah,
If they cannot recover the planes because of
right.
bad weather,
So they have to
the
circuit.
plane with the body, yes, will keep
Yeah, very
refueling the
good.
other aircraft until they can return to the tanker because the fuel capacity with the body system on the Skyhawk, in any case, is not a big one. So the idea was to launch an attack, and the plane with the body system will be over the carrier on the launch, and then on the return of the planes will be over the carrier. So if any plane had a problem and needed to refuel, they can refuel from that aircraft. But it was only a plan. It was tested during April for the operations with the carrier, but
Hmm.
no, during the operational sorties, it was not used because there were no airstrikes from the carrier. So
Right.
in the end, it was not used
So,
on combat operations.
did they ever? What was there ever consideration for a second attempt at um, the bonsai night, if you will, as it was called? Was there ever any considerations that you're aware of attempting a second attempt at a carrier on carrier strike? Or I mean, was the hitting of the Belgrano pretty much a sealed deal as far as changing overall? In other words, we always kind of treat it as this happened, then this happened, but
Yeah.
there has to have been some sort of debate over that. I just don't know if you've run into any research around that.
Yeah, after the Belgrano was sunk, the order from the Navy was immediately to withdraw the aircraft carrier.
Okay.
So immediately after, the carrier returned to the coast, and the Skyhawks were deployed to Rio Grande. So the idea to use the carrier was left behind because it was considered a big risk to
Yeah.
lose the
Sure.
carrier.
Sure. Absolutely. Um, and then it was so the Skyhawks that came off of 25th of May. They went directly to San Julian, or did they? I can't remember. Did,
No, they went to San Julian, to
yeah,
sorry, to Rio Grande,
to Rio Grande. Okay, all right.
because
So they
Rio
went
Grande is a naval aviation base.
right,
So
right.
all naval aviation strike aircraft, Super Tendards, and Skyhawks were operating from Rio Grande.
So at that point, they probably weren't extremely prepared to do inter-service communications. The one thing I did have a question on. I'm looking at my phone because I put all my notes here. Sorry. So what was the difference between the CIC and the EI as far as the radar installations on the island, on the East Malvinas island?
The CAC was the operations and information command post,
Okay.
which operates the Air Force radar.
Right.
In fact, they didn't operate it. They received information from the radar operators, and then they guide the aircraft.
Hmm.
So the army already had their own radar, and they for sometimes they operated coordinated with. They also send information to the CAC of the Air Force to guide aircraft. But it was an old radar, and it was not the main radar used on the during the war to guide the aircraft.
So yeah, so just anything around that. What would have been the typical, like, who would have seen things first? Would it have been the naval radar operators um, near the coast, or would it have been, as you just said, Army forward observers, or whoever calling it in the Air Force, who then called it in. It just seems like, again, a logistical nightmare of trying to not only determine when something is there, but then to be able to get it back um, to your head, to the headquarters. And was it all? It was all going to where? Where was that main headquarters for FAA as far as the
Yeah,
coordination on the on the continent?
the command of the when the war started, the Air Force created what they call the Fuerza Aérea Sur, which was means South Air Force, which the headquarters were in Comodoro Rivadavia.
Hmm. Which
There
is
was the
further up the coast,
brigadier, the commander of the Air Force.
right? Hmm.
So all the information from all the bases, from the islands, went there, and
Hmm.
there they decided what to do. In any case, there was always a problem with the coordination, especially with the Navy, because there was rivalry between the services, and the Navy wanted to make the missions by their own in many cases, especially with the superintendents.
Right.
So there was always some problems on the relationship between the Air Force and the Navy, also with the Army. But the main problem was between the naval aviation and the Air Force. So, but on the islands, the command posts gather all the information from forward observers, from the radars,
Hmm.
from everyone, and when they see a possible target or they need some an airstrike, or they send the information to Comodoro Rivadavia, and from there they make the orders to all the bases. So they decide which aircraft will go with the weapons, anything. Then they said what they call the fragmentary order. It was a small order with the details of how many aircraft bombs, anything, the refueling uh, system, if they were going to do air refueling or not. So all the that was organized from the command post in Comodoro Rivadavia. And but as I said, sometimes there were problems with the Navy because the Navy wanted to make their own missions without or coordinating with the Air Force.
Right. And there was probably some contention over time on tanker, right? Too, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Several times, and I should have written a better note about this, but several times it's mentioned that flights were guided by Omega. Was that an Omega? Is that an air search radar, or how was that used? I mean, it sounded like it was used as a navigational
yeah,
pathfinding, and was it primarily a flight leader that would be? It seemed like certain airframes, certain aircraft had it, and others didn't. Am I right in that?
yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
only a few planes were using this system, which was a direction finding system.
Mm.
So they
Okay.
just
So
put
was
the
it?
coordinates and then they try
Oh.
to go to the coordinates.
Oh, interesting. Was it based on radio direction finding?
I think I don't know
Yeah, we can.
exactly how
Yeah,
it worked because it was an old system, but I think
interesting.
it was with the radio or something like that.
Okay, so but it was pretty accurate. It must have been more accurate than trying to do it on a map on your lap, right? I guess
Yeah, and
is
also the
probably
problem is that flying very low over the sea, it was very difficult to make a
yeah,
navigation.
yeah. There's no orientation. Yeah, I can
Yeah, and
understand.
also flying low, the pilots were more focused on not on trying not to crash over the sea,
Sure.
so they had to ju- just navigate with the equipment they have as easy as possible. So
Um,
also over the islands, during April they made a lot of flights over the islands to try to know them. But in any case, there were so many small islands; it's very difficult to identify all the places. So you'll find a couple of times during the war that the pilots they misplaced their position. They thought they were in one place, and in fact they were in a different place.
I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to ask you about how much how much non-British maritime traffic was potentially still involved throughout, because it sounded like there was at least certain instances where Argentine pilots were possibly bombing a scuttled Argentine ship in the middle of the the sound there. Is that, am I right with that?
Yeah. Yeah, there were not many ships, but
Right,
there were few Argentinian ships that remained on the islands.
right.
In
And but
fact,
most
one. Yeah, sorry.
but most of most of the logistical resupplying was done by cargo planes that were still flying into the port um,
Yeah,
up until the last hour, right?
yeah.
If I read that
Yeah,
correctly.
during April, a lot of ships were sent to the islands with support. The problem what is that the islands by then the harbor had only a very very small pier, so
Okay.
they cannot unload all the ships at once. So when the British arrived on the 1st of May, there were still four cargo ships, still on the islands. One of them, the Formosa, which was a civil cargo ship, returned to the mainland, but it was attacked by mistake by the Skyhawks on that day.
Hmm.
They hit the ship with a bomb, but fortunately it didn't explode. But and the other three remained on the islands. One was destroyed by the Alacrity frigate. One was damaged also and abandoned, and also on 21st of May, one Skyhawk also attacked the remains of that ship. It was
Yeah.
destroyed already.
Right.
It was the Rio Carcarañá, and the third one, the Bahía Buen Suceso, was stayed in Port Howard until it was attacked by the British, and it was sunk after the war. It was sunk by the British. So after that, there were a few small ships, very small ships on the islands, two patrol ships sent by the Coast Guards, and there were also two ships that were operating on the islands before the war and were used to support some Argentinian positions.
Um, um, I don't know how often you maybe mentioned it, and you might have kind of hinted at it in the book, but there were a lot of fusing problems, right, on the bombs that were utilized. Do you have any more information about that? Like when when, if ever, did was a the the fuse timing fixed? It seemed like it might have been kind of uh, alleviated by possibly the end of May. Do you have any information around that from your research?
Yeah, the first problem was because of this rivalry between the Navy and the Air Force. The Air Force don't have any information on how to attack ships because the operations over the sea were responsibility of the Navy, and the
Hmm.
Air Force was only dedicated to attack ground targets. So during the April, they tried to get information on how to attack the ships, but they get little support from the Navy.
Hmm.
So the initial idea from the Air Force was that as to use the bigger bombs as possible, and they only have they use the normal fuse they use on ground targets.
Right.
So they started using a lot the Mark 17 British bombs, and the problem that the bomb was so heavy that, for example, it was the case on Glasgow. The bomb passed through the ship and exploded on the other side because of the energy that had the bomb because of being so heavy, and the ships were not they have no armor. So that was the first problem they have at the and also the fuses were thought for ground targets when they will hit something very hard and then they will explode,
Right.
and
Right.
also they were planned to be dropped from higher altitudes. So when they start using the bombs from low altitudes, the fuses didn't arm completely, and but they didn't realize this at the beginning because, for example, at San Carlos, the pilots they just dropped the bombs and escaped. They never tried to look if the bomb had exploded. So they started realizing that, and of course, one of the main helps came from the BBC when a journalist from the BBC told openly that the bombs were not exploding. So then they
Hmm.
started realizing that, and they start changing the fuses around 23rd, 24th of May. They started also adding fuses from with that exploded after some time. So if the bomb hit the ship and didn't explode, after some minutes or seconds will explode anyway. So and also started changing tactics. For example, with the case of Coventry, the planes attacked from in diagonal from from the ship, and not at 90 degrees.
Hmm.
And also they were carrying the new fuses. That's why at least two of the bombs that hit Coventry exploded and the ship sank very fast.
Hmm.
But after that, the operations over San Carlos started to decrease because the landing was completely made, and also the Air Force had lost a lot of planes.
Right.
So
Right.
the biggest operations after that were on Pleasant Bay on 8th of June, when they also attacked and hit the
Right.
Sagara Hudson system, and also a landing craft.
So my last question. So kind of around that, what there really wasn't much of an opportunity for any of these aircraft to perform like more of a close air support um, capability, but there were other aircraft on the islands, right? There was Pucara and Air Mashi, right? So some of these lighter aircraft, of course, some of them, a pretty good amount of them, probably were taken out by certain clandestine operations, of course. But um, would was the communications relay and network on the island even capable of supporting any close air support operations?
Yeah. It
Probably,
was not easy because
right?
the main problem was that most of the combats were during the night, and the planes have no night capability.
Right.
So, but on the 28th of May, during the battle for Goose Green, which started on the night but lasted for the whole day, the
Hmm.
Pucaras and their Maquis made some ground support operations.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, because also the Air Force tried to send Skyhawks and Mirage, but the clouds were very, very low. So it was very dangerous for them to
Yeah.
fly over the clouds. So they
Right.
sent it
There was
to
some
us, and
friendly fire there too, right? I think there was a couple friendly fire incidents there as well, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yes, we had one on the 1st of May, when a Dagger was shot down, and then on 12th of May when a Skyhawk, after attacking Glasgow, was shot down over Goose Green. But because the Air Force, they made some areas where they our own planes cannot fly, because there was the anti-aircraft artillery, was one over the airport, the main airport of the islands, and one over Goose Green. So the case of the 1st of May, for example, was a Mirage that, after a dogfight with the Sea Harriers, the pilot realized that he don't have enough fuel to return to the mainland. So he decided to land on the airport, but despite the runway was very short, was only 1,200 meters,
Hmm.
but he tried to do it anyway. And all the artillery was informed that this plane was coming, but the problem was they were just bombed by Sea Harriers a few minutes before,
Hmm.
and the Mirage, the pilot decided to eject the two missiles, because in case he ran out of the runway,
Hmm.
the missiles could explode. So he decided to eject it like bombs.
Yeah. So he looked like,
And
yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and the gunners of one piece, they saw the missiles going down. They said, "No, this is a British plane that is
Right.
bombing us." So they opened fire,
Right.
and the Mirage was on final approach, so it was very low and slow. It was a very easy target. And on the other case, was a pilot who was returning from attacking Glasgow, an A4B, and the weather was bad over the island, so he didn't see the ground. He was over the clouds, and on the escape route, they went over Goose Green,
Hmm.
and the artillery was radar guided, so they never saw the plane. They just found it a target on the radar inside the area which was forbidden for Argentinian planes, and they
Hmm.
just opened fire.
Right. Right. Well, I hate to cut us short, but unfortunately, work calls, right? Yeah, whatever. But I've really enjoyed our conversation. I hope we get another chance to talk.
Yeah.
We're hopefully having an author roundtable on the April 20th. I hope you can make that.
Yes.
So it would be great to have yourself and Mariano and Jorge to kind of talk. I'm assuming you know each other reasonably
Yes.
well, and so it should be a good conversation. So it's been great talking to you. You've given me several. Every time I talk to an author, I get something beyond the book. But the book itself is Skyhawks Over the Atlantic. Hopefully, I can get it to show up here. There we go. Buy it. It's very good, extremely good,
Thanks.
well researched, and I think the concentration on the one topic and the one aircraft type, I think helps it considerably. It's very concise and thorough. So I really enjoyed it, and I think everybody else would as well. So buy it. All right,
Thank you.
take care.